Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to Texas Public Policy Foundation's live stream, Biden's Border Crisis, the Convergence of Drug Cartels and Mass Migration. My name is John Hostettler, and I'm Vice President of Federal Affairs for the Foundation. In a previous life, I served 12 years or 6 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, 2 of those terms serving as chairman of the Subcommittee on Immigration, Border Security, and Claims for the Judiciary Committee. We're blessed to be joined today by 2 prominent experts in the areas of border security and Mexico. Both are colleagues at the Foundation. First of all, Rodney Scott is our Distinguished Senior Fellow for Border Security. Rodney served as the 24th Chief of the United States Border Patrol, and former acting CBP Commissioner Mark Morgan called Rodney, quote, the absolute embodiment of the U.S. Border Patrol's motto, honor first, end quote. We couldn't agree more. Prior to his elevation to chief, Rodney served as chief border patrol agent of the El Centro, California sector, assistant chief in U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Office of Anti-Terrorism, and director of the Incident Management and Operations Coordination Division at Customs and Border Protection headquarters in Washington, D.C. Chief Scott provides TPPF with analysis and recommendations on federal, state, and local border security efforts. Also, Josh Treviño is Chief Intelligence and Research Director at the Foundation. Prior to Josh's stretch at TPPF, Josh was Vice President of Strategy at the Illinois Policy Institute of Chicago. Prior to that, he was Vice President of Communications at TPPF for 6 years. Josh's other experience includes an independent media consultancy, a consultancy at Booz Allen Hamilton, Vice President of Policy at the Pacific Research Institute in San Francisco, and service as a speechwriter and an international health professional in the administration of President George W. Bush. Last, but certainly not least, Josh served as an officer in the United States Army. I first of all would like to direct this first question to Rodney. Rodney, let's look at the first part of the title of our live stream. The current crisis can be summed up by the change in enforcement encounters by U.S. Customs and Border Protection at the U.S.-Mexico border from April 2020, the last year of the Trump administration, to April 2021, barely 3 months into the administration of President Joe Biden. According to official reports, enforcement encounters at the southwest border were slightly more than 17,000 in April 2020 and more than 178,000 in April 2021, a 10-fold increase. Since April 2021, encounters have averaged just short of 200,000 per month. Rodney, you were the highest-ranking Border Patrol agent, U.S. Border Patrol chief, in April 2020 and April 2021. A couple of questions for you. First, can you tell us what changed? What 2 or 3 policies did the Biden administration put in place or terminate that had the most significant impact to get us where we are today? And second, how has the evolution of cartel involvement in human smuggling added to the crisis?
Well, thank you, John. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody today. So I can summarize basically what changed in general terms, and then I'll get a little more specific. But it was both the rhetoric coming out of the White House and it was actions on behalf of the White House. What do I mean by that? Every administration, not just the prior one, before the Biden administration, actually took the border seriously and was constantly improving border security. Not all at the same level, but they were never going backwards, is the best way to say it. The Trump administration had very strong rhetoric about border security and immigration, but then backed it up with actions. Some of those actions were the migrant protection protocols, commonly referred to as Remain in Mexico, that just made people wait outside the country until a judge determined if they had a legitimate asylum claim or not. That massively reduced the fraud at the border, and that reduced how many people were trying to come into the United States because they knew that they wouldn't get released. And that's the second piece. Really, the catch with the Remain in Mexico was catch and release. This administration re-implemented policies that actually resulted in people being released into the United States waiting for a court hearing. At the same time, in the run-up to the election and then shortly after, all the messaging coming out of the White House was received worldwide as the borders are open and we're going to be more welcoming and we're going to help you. We're going to allow you to come into the United States. And then when the first wave came and they actually found that that was true, they all called home. And then the tidal wave of mass illegal immigration that we have today took place. There were some soft power things going on behind the scenes. The last administration, the Trump administration, put a lot of pressure on our partners in the Western Hemisphere, other countries, to just enforce their own laws. And then basically we started yanking travel visas away from government officials that were either tied to smuggling or we believed that they were. So all that combined actually resulted in a much more secure border. Over the many, many years, the cartels have been using illegal immigration to actually facilitate their drug smuggling and their other activities. There's different cartels, and different cartels adopted alien smuggling at different levels. But at no time in history have we seen the unprecedented control of the southwest border by the cartels that we have today. And that's really, again, because of the mass migration that this administration is given as a gift, really, to the cartels. They use the people not only to make money, but to script border crossings so that they can overwhelm law enforcement, create controllable gaps in the border security, and then get in their second wave, which is usually the narcotics, the criminals, the people that want to avoid border security. Again, we've seen different types. I think we'll talk about that a little bit more later about when that really took place and how we got to where we are today. But it's been an evolution, and then different cartels adopted that at different times. But today, the cartels control everything that crosses the border. There's really no differentiation between illegal immigration and narcotic smuggling.
Thank you, Rodney. Josh, we'll turn to you. Rodney's given us an overview of the situation from the perspective north of the border. You can provide us with perspectives south of the border. In a lengthy discussion of the situation there, the New York Times observed last year, quote, "For years, independent coyotes paid cartels a tax to move migrants through territory they controlled along the border, and the criminal syndicates stuck to their traditional line of business, drug smuggling, which was far more profitable. That began to change around 2019, the acting deputy director at U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement told Congress in 2021. The sheer number of people seeking to cross made migrant smuggling an irresistible moneymaker for some cartels," he said, end quote. It's important to note that the current president of Mexico, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, otherwise known as AMLO, assumed that office in December 2018. Josh, in your research, you state, quote, "It has become increasingly difficult for observers of Mexico, particularly as it currently stands under President Obrador's conciliatory policies toward criminal organizations, to deny that cartel-driven corruption has penetrated deep into the heart of the business and political elite of Mexico. This reality directly affects the safety and security of Texas communities and families that must endure criminality emanating from Mexico," end quote. Can you elaborate on the situation, Josh, that's resulted in cartels thriving under the current national administration in Mexico City, and how this corruption has contributed to the crisis in Texas and the U.S. generally?
Yeah, well, thank you, John, for throwing me the very short and concise topic on this one. Look, Mexico has always had a tremendous issue with corruption, with state corruption, with the intersection of the state and criminal organizations. And so in that sense, what's happening now is not as a type especially new. What is new and what has become really an existential crisis for Mexico as both a state and society across the past decade, and it's only accelerated under the AMLO regime since 2018, is this increasing cooperation and symbiosis between the criminal cartels and the state itself. It's no longer a kind of the more traditional function of criminals having their own vein and sort of paying a tax to corrupt public officials. It now goes all the way to the top in Mexico. And we have said very publicly, along with many of our coalition partners, that we believe that the president of Mexico himself is in more or less open alliance with several of the cartels, the Sinaloans, chief among them. And the Mexican state, in its various guises, whether you're talking about, the Secretario de Gobernación or INM or Sedena, which is the army, really finds itself in the position of participating in and or managing cartel operations and relations. And so this is an incredibly dangerous scenario for those of us in the United States, for native South Texans like myself, who really have to face a very sad reality, and it's not one that we welcome, which is that the Mexican state is not a friend of ours anymore. That was not always the case. You don't have to go back very far in time. For example, the Calderon administration, 2006 to 2012, to find a Mexican state that at least wanted to do the right thing, even if it was not always competent to do so. But now we face the reality, and we have to face this reality squarely, that the Mexican state is not a friend, that in fact, most of the time is in league in some way with the cartels, or is often a cartel itself. Many of the preeminent human traffickers in particular are often from the Migration Institute, are often affiliated with the army. This introduces a whole new dimension to the scope and nature of the problem facing us at the border. One thing that Washington, D.C. has been incredibly deficient at facing is acknowledging this reality. There's a real, what I term a 1994 mindset, 94, of course, being the year that NAFTA was first implemented, in this belief that you can have positive relations with the formal Mexican state and work with them to push them to do the right thing. I think that was true in 1994. It is not true in 2023. And John, we can go into specific policy solutions as you wish in this conversation, but the bottom line for us is that we have to be realistic about the nature of that state. The Mexican people are good people. I'm half Mexican, so I can speak firsthand to that. They suffer the most, but the secondary victims are us, and we have an obligation in the United States and a duty to defend ourselves, come what may.
Thanks, Josh. Rodney, you've had the opportunity to testify multiple times before Congress on the border crisis, including on the leadership of Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Can you share with us what you shared with those committees about his stewardship of that role, especially important since you were chief in the early days of his leadership there?
Sure, kind of like Josh said a minute ago, such a short topic. To summarize it, though, what I testified before Congress is what I put in a letter to Congress right after I retired. And that again, summarizing this administration, but specifically Secretary Mayorkas, isn't even trying. He's forbidden the personnel within CBP, within the United States Border Patrol, from even having the public discussions that Josh was just talking about. Just factual, that there are threats, there are real threats facing this country coming across the border every single day. And he's pushed this rhetoric out into the public, and unfortunately the mainstream media has picked it up. That this is a asylum, this is a humanitarian issue, people are just trying to claim asylum. And if you look at it, and I reminded Congress, and then I give them specifics, pay attention to this administration's words. They very intentionally refuse to acknowledge the 140 terrorists that have been identified, individual terrorist ties that have been identified coming across the southwest border. They refuse to talk about the 1.7 million identified, documented gotaways that the U.S. Border Patrol has brought forward. And why would those people, if they were asylum seekers, intentionally try to avoid law enforcement? So the biggest difference, going back to the beginning, is actually a sincere effort to secure the borders of the United States so that we know who and what is entering our country, and we make rational decisions based on that information. This administration walked away from that. The threats are national security threats, not just immigration. And that's what I highlighted to Congress. And again, talked about specific policies this administration tore down. And then even stopping the border wall. You hear a lot about that, but no one wants to talk about that. They shut off the entire technology package that was going in with that border wall. So they really shut off the eyes of the Border Patrol at the same time as they made enforcing the law significantly more difficult. The secretary is derelict in his duties. He's protecting a lot of people out there, but not a single one of them are Americans. It seems like his entire focus is on the rest of the world.
Thank you. Thanks, Rodney. Josh, you've taken a policy leadership role in Washington as Congress is considering two various approaches to addressing the escalating danger to public safety and national security posed by the cartels.
Mhm.
Those approaches include the authorization of the use of military force, or AUMF, similar to what was enacted against first Al-Qaeda and then second Iraq after 9/11, and then the designation of Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs, which would permit extensive operational and sanction authority of the US government against these cartels. You've concentrated on the FTO designation option in your research. So could you tell us the benefit of such a designation? And if you'd like to speak on the AUMF declaration, please feel free to do that as well, Josh.
Yes, again with the small questions, John. Look, we've published research. We're a research-based organization, so everything that we do starts with that. We've published research on designating Mexican cartels as foreign terror organizations, and we should make no mistake, they absolutely fit the definition as intended by the authors of the original enabling legislation of foreign terror organizations. They fit the definition, and from a prudential standpoint, they ought to be designated as such. They are organizations that go far beyond the normal ambit of organized crime. They have explicitly political and sovereignty-focused goals at this point. We can go into that if you want to, but suffice it to say that these are less well understood as simple trafficking organizations and much better understood as effectively warlords with extensive commercial arms. And so if Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda and ISIS qualify as terror organizations, and they do, then so too does Nueva Generación, Cartel del Golfo, the Sinaloans, and so on in Mexico. So we have an obligation to call things what they are. We should also understand that a foreign terror designation enables prosecutorial actions within the United States, particularly in the realm of rolling up material support that doesn't presently exist. And I don't think really there's a credible argument for failing to bring all tools to bear against these organizations, especially since the organizations don't just exist in Mexico. And when we talk about Mexican cartels, we have to understand that these are entities, although they may be most visible in Mexico because that's where they conduct their gun battles, that's where they are from, it's where they live, it's where they're openly trafficking people, but they themselves tend to have operations in all 50 states of the United States. And so we have to understand that this is a threat, not just across the southern border, but also here at home. A foreign terror designation, we should be candid, also does raise the specter of military action. I want to be 100% clear. That's not something that we want. That is an item of last resort. But what we have consistently argued for is that all options ought to be on the table. Nobody, I think, of goodwill or good sense thinks that a militarization of the cartel issue is the item of first resort. But we also believe that it must be an item of resort, possibly of last resort, but somewhere in the toolkit, because otherwise, what is a national security establishment for? One of the lines that we hear quite a bit, and this is external to the ambit of the foundation, is how is it that the United States government can be so proactive and avid in defending the borders of Ukraine, but not the borders of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California? And that is a good question to ask because it's very illuminating as to what the actual policy priorities of the regime in Washington, D.C. Actually are. Now, as for an AUMF, as you know, John, an AUMF is an authorization for the use of military force. We have not done specific research on that, but we have talked about it a bit. We believe that an AUMF is useful to the extent that it achieves the political ends, not the military ends, but the political ends that an FTO designation would achieve, which is persuading the Mexican side that the United States really is willing to put all options on the table. Ultimately, what we've seen is that the Mexican state, to the extent that it exists as a coherent whole, really only cares about two big things. One is keeping the Americans out, and the other is keeping the money flowing south. It's unfortunate to say that. You would hope that there would be a sense of stewardship. Mexico is actually a great nation with great people, but its elites and its regime do not live up to that greatness or that promise. And so, President Trump, I think, illustrated very well that when you threaten the flow of money, as he did with tariffs, that you do get results. Absent that credible threat, which does not exist under the Biden administration, we're not going to see any results from Mexico, no change at the southern border. We have to bring that credibility back. And that's why FTO and AUMF matter so much.
Thanks, Josh. And Josh, you've given us a great segue into this final question. But before I pose that to Rodney, I just want to remind our audience that we'll be taking questions after this question, after Rodney answers this last question. So if you have questions for Rodney and or Josh, please type it into your chat there, and I will present that to Rodney and Josh. Actually, they probably might have that on their screen. But anyway, Rodney, Josh has given us some points of view, some takebacks from this as far as what policy provisions need to go in place vis-a-vis Mexico, FTO, potentially AUMF. Could you talk to us about what we need to do policy-wise to once again secure the border?
Sure, and I want to start out by just echoing what Josh said. That literally, or if I could just say, supporting what Josh just said. Everything he outlined is true. That I want to add a couple of little things before I get into the next step. There's a saying in Mexico, silver or lead, because the cartels have gotten so powerful that you can either take their money or they basically threaten your life and your family. The Trump administration understood that dynamic and had to make weighing those probabilities more beneficial to work with the United States than to work with the cartels. And that's really what we need to reinstate to secure the border. Even above infrastructure, we have to create a deterrent to illegal activity, and the actions have to match the words. So just think about your children, for example. You can say whatever you want all day long, but unless they believe that there's actually going to be a consequence for violating what you've instructed them to do, they're going to keep doing it. It's the same thing on the border. There has to be a consequence for illegal entry, and there has to be a consequence for Mexico for supporting, or at least ignoring, but I believe supporting these cartels and these factions. And I want to add one other thing. Well, I'll give you a couple quick policy implementation pieces. First and foremost, you just have to make sure that the judicial process is put in the right order, that people do not get released into the United States, which is what they ultimately want, until a judge has heard their case. It's very simple. You have to detain them until the court date, or you have to keep them in Mexico. And then the border wall, the infrastructure does create a deterrent. It actually makes every Border Patrol agent out there in the field more effective. They can cover more area. And that ensures that we know who and what's coming into the United States. We actually have a chance to interdict them. But if they're all going to be released, there's nothing the Border Patrol can do to slow down that flow. So last but not least, I do agree 100% with Josh that we need to go back in and leverage some of the soft power. We need to influence Mexico and other countries in this hemisphere, but Mexico is literally our next door neighbor. That has to start there. And we have to make it more advantageous for them to work with the United States than to work with the cartels. And every single day we wait to implement that, it's going to get harder and harder. And then on my last note, kind of putting this all together, some people out there may have heard the term Los Zetas. So that was a enforcement arm of a cartel in Mexico. But the reason that was so important, and I'm bringing it up now, is they were trained by American Special Forces. They got exposed to a lot of our war college type concepts, strategic thinking in a military operation. And then they went to the cartels. They went to a cartel, created their own. However, that influence is now spread. So again, back to what Josh was saying, this isn't like street crime or like just traffickers. These are now strategic thinking organizations that have realized that not only do they want to smuggle drugs and make a bunch of money, that they can make even more money and make all their processes a lot easier if they control government as well. They know what they're doing. Their arms, their tentacles come well into the United States, as Josh just said. So this has to be a multifaceted front, and we really need to put every option on the table.
Thank you, Rodney. I'm looking for questions here. I don't see any at this point, but I'd like to head back to Rodney one more time to talk about how the cartels use, specifically how cartels use migrants who are being smuggled across the border to cloak the movement of drugs coming across the border. And folks might have heard of this several times, but I don't think we can hear too much how this works operationally and how these drugs ultimately wind up in America's streets and in the bodies of our young people and the tragic victims here. Rodney, could you share with us?
Sure. Thanks for bringing that up, John. And I want to start out with reminding everybody that the border is literally a transit zone. Nothing stays at the border. It's all going to some destination somewhere across the United States. And while John's 100% accurate about the narcotics, I want people, as I have this conversation with you, to also think about it's not just narcotics, it's not just commodities. It's anybody that's willing to pay the cartel more money to avoid interacting with law enforcement. Asylum seekers don't fear law enforcement. They're actually trying to seek them out. But the second wave that I'm going to talk about, that includes criminals, anybody that thinks they're wanted by the government, anybody that thinks we may have information on their terrorist activities. They're going to wait for the second wave. So this is what the cartels have done for years. They basically have people controlling every section of border. They make sure that anything crosses through that area or crosses through the border. They control the time, they control how many. And traditionally, they would distract law enforcement a little bit. But again, the military tactics infusion into the cartels, they've learned that these massive amounts of illegal immigration it allows them to crossings and overwhelm all law enforcement. So let me make it really simple. They pay somebody to be on the border all day, every day to watch what's going on. That scout, if you will, counts how many border patrol are out there, how many Texas DPS. They know where all the cameras are. They know when our helicopters take off. Based on that information, they then communicate, we need to push across approximately, fill in the blank, 100 or 25 or 5 groups of 25 each of illegal aliens. Whether they're willing to give up or not is almost irrelevant, because that elicits a law enforcement response. The law enforcement response pulls agents in from other areas. It's inevitable. And then that leaves gaps in the border that the cartel quickly takes advantage of because they've strategically controlled those gaps. And that's when the second wave comes through. That's sometimes identified as known gotaways, and many times we don't have anybody or any technology there to even know. So that's the fentanyl, that's the cocaine, the heroin, but it's also the criminals that have been deported from the United States before for committing crimes. It's also anybody that thinks, whether we do or not, whether they think we might have information on them where we would detain them and not release them in the United States. Those are the real threats. And this is, I got to drive this home. This administration, regardless of what Secretary Mayorkas says publicly, they know this is going on. I detailed it in writing and in many briefings for leadership, just like many other government officials in law enforcement and border security have. They know it's going on and they choose to ignore it for whatever reason. But the cartel is using the massive amounts of illegal immigration to really reduce the overhead and reduce the risk of smuggling in every other commodity that they could possibly want to bring into our country. That's why I say they now have control over the borders and who and what enters the U.S. as opposed to the U.S. government. And we've got to take that back.
Sure do. Thanks, Rodney. Josh, we've got a question from Alex. How do we properly communicate the difference between a criminal cartel and a semi-governmental terrorist group, given what you said about cartels and their political and governmental intentions and influence, rather than just criminal in nature?
Yeah, well, look, it's effectively whether they're sovereignty seeking, right? I mean, this is a little bit of a philosophical debate, but it does have meaning in terms of the application of the law. We think we know. You can read our research on this at TexasPolicy.com. That the cartels, as Rodney correctly said, are sovereignty-seeking organizations. They seek to rule. They understand that their profits are maximized if they themselves are sovereign actors. And they achieve that in one of two ways. They either replace the state, which by the way, the state frequently cooperates in because it generates profit from that end as well, or they subordinate it to themselves through the ordinary processes of corruption. Ambassador Christopher Landau, who was Trump's ambassador to Mexico City, a very good man. We worked with him. He's been spoken at TPPF several times. Publicly estimated that about 35 to 45% of Mexico's territory, and this is a 2-year-old estimate at this point, it's probably more now, is under direct cartel rule. Just imagine that, surrendering nearly half of the national territory to politicized criminal gangs, to terrorist organizations. That's what's happened in Mexico. And we have to be clear, it's not because the state was pushed out of these spaces. It's because the state chose to cede these spaces to these organizations with which it is largely in league in some fashion. And that's a very important distinction. So the terror organization designation is obvious, it's evident, and the differentiation between what we've described as an ordinary criminal group, we think is evident on its face.
Thanks, Josh. We've run up against our end of time of this live stream. I want to apologize to Thomas. Thomas, I'm going to be lobbying for a second bite at the apple, maybe a sequel to this. And I want to thank Josh Treviño and Rodney Scott for being with us today and for your expertise and your service to the foundation and to our country. Thank you to the audience for being with us today. God bless, and until we see you again, goodbye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.